Again, thank you to Dr. Dodson, and thank you very much, Dr. Rakoff, for wonderful presentations, setting up our panel conversation. If the panelists could come up right now, I'm going to introduce Robert Pondisio, who will be leading the panel. Robert is the Vice President Director of Communications for Core Knowledge Foundation. He brings over 25 years of media, communications, and classroom experience to his role. Robert launched the popular Core Knowledge blog in December 2007. Prior to joining the foundation, he taught 5th grade in the South Bronx for several years under the aegis of the New York City Teaching Fellows. Prior to teaching, Robert was Communications Director for Business Week and served for many years as Public Affairs Director for Time Magazine. Thank you very much for leading the panel conversation.
Good morning. Since we are running a little bit behind on time, I will be brisk with my few remarks, very few. I was thinking, as I often do when I come to Pioneer events, that I'm reminded of two things. The first is what a privilege it is to spend time among highly educated, extremely engaged fellow citizens, as it were, for whom history and public policy is a lively and engaging topic. The very next thought I always have is how it saddens me how few of our students, those of us who are in K-12 education, could not just participate in a forum like this, but even understand it, how much of it would go over their heads. I was a 5th grade teacher, as Jim just mentioned, in the South Bronx in the era of No Child Left Behind. I'm from New York, and by the way, I'm a Mets fan, not a Yankees fan. I want to absolutely set the record straight on that. So Cubs fans, I feel your pain. As a 5th grade teacher in New York, there was at one point a recently disbanded 5th grade cumulative K-5 social studies test. I taught at PS 277 in the South Bronx, which, by way of perspective, District 7 in the South Bronx is the lowest scoring district in New York City. My school, PS 277, was the lowest scoring school in that district. So my school was the de facto worst of the worst, as it were. So in 6 weeks, I was entrusted with remediating all that my students had not learned about history and social studies in the previous 6 years, and it was uphill work. The one moment that crystallized this for me, I remember in my first or second year of teaching, we were in the middle of the South Bronx, 148th Street. I asked my students to look out the window and imagine what they would see if they were looking out of this window 100 years, 1,000 years previously. And they literally could not do it. They could not form a picture in their mind of what the world would have looked like. I remember one young man, when I asked, what do you think you would see out the window 1,000 years ago, thought for a moment and said, dinosaurs? Which is ruefully amusing, but it's quite sad that they had no historical perspective. When we think, and this is just not my anecdote, if you look at the 2006 NAEP results, it showed that students got precious little attention, or the results got precious little attention from our K-12 system and a policy agenda that tends to worship at the altar of reading and math almost exclusively and frets regularly about things like college and career readiness or whether we can turn out enough STEM graduates to remain economically competitive. 5% of 12th graders qualified, 1 out of 20, having advanced knowledge in civics. 22% as proficient, which means the rest, 3 out of 4, were either basic or below basic, which roughly translates, in the words of the old Sam Cooke song, to they don't know much about history. So here to grapple with that, let me introduce the panelists from left to right. At my immediate left is Roger DeRosiers. He is taught at the Millbury Memorial Junior Senior High School in Millbury, Massachusetts for more than 3 decades, teaching primarily U.S. history and government. He is presently a member of the Massachusetts Special Commission on Civic Engagement and Learning. Next to Roger is Christina Blunt, Senior Project Coordinator at the Program on Humanitarian Policy and Conflict Research at Harvard. Prior to this position, she was a researcher at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and for Polis Media in the UK. To Christina's right is the legendary Will Fitzhugh. He is the founder and editor of the Concord Review, and in my personal opinion, an American hero. It is the only journal in the world that publishes the academic research of secondary students, and long may it continue to do so. And to the extreme right is Dr. Anders Lewis. He is the history teacher and art and history department chair at the Advanced Math and Science Academy Charter School in Marlborough. He is also the author, along with Sandra Stotsky, who I'm pleased to see with us today, of The Rise and Fall of the Study of American History in Massachusetts, the paper which I believe you all have on your table. Given that I'm just going to start with this question, given that my perspective on teaching is probably skewed by the fact that I did work in such a low-performing school, I don't want to assume that my experience is universal, even if NAEP suggests that it might be closer to common than not. I would just like, from left to right, to start us off by giving us, in a minute or so, your sense of how well or how poorly, in your personal experience, our students are doing with history in our schools. Roger, let's start with you.
Thank you very much to the Pioneer Institute, Jim and Jamie, for these opportunities. Much appreciated. In response to the question, I think that we're probably looking at a time frame where things are ebbing and rather waning and really not doing as well as one might have expected. There are, I guess we could go to the fact that the MCAS test in history and social science not being offered has given a license to districts to minimize instruction in history and the social studies, particularly at the elementary levels, but also at the middle as well as at the high school levels as well. So I guess a brief answer to your question is where we might have seen some progress and might have seen greater attention being given to the study of history and the social sciences. My sense is that the MCAS has given districts, for whether it be economic notions or simply to make sure that the accountability for which they are measured, which is going to be through the ELA and the math and even the science scores, has essentially minimized or marginalized history and social science.
Can you all hear me okay? My voice doesn't quite project like Mr. DeRocher's. I should say my professional biography doesn't give much of a clue as to why I'm here. I'm a former student of Roger DeRocher at the Millbury High School, and I'm what you might consider the beta version of the MCAS system. I graduated from public high school in Massachusetts in 2003 with the first class that was required to pass the test to do so. I continue volunteering as a judge for the We the People competition, which was just held in Massachusetts this past weekend, and it tests students on their ability to engage with some of the founding documents of U.S. history. So my perspective isn't one from that of an educator, although I do work in an educational setting. I can offer you my own experience of what it was like to come through that system. We did have to take an MCAS test on U.S. history, although it was not required for our graduation. I can tell you from the perspective of a 12, 13, 14, 15, 16-year-old, it's hard to grasp which of the tests you're given are really going to get you through the doors, in which you're just being given to assess your knowledge. I think at that age and at that stage when you're being evaluated, it's all a bit scary. And I think the curriculum being tailored to that kind of testing has both pros and cons, which I'm happy to talk about a bit more when the conversation gets around to that point. One thing I did notice just this past weekend in participating in the We the People competition is the extreme sense of importance around some of the documents and around U.S. history that's placed in this sort of program, but still the development of the ability to really understand the material. And I think that that's something that doesn't necessarily require a state-sponsored examination to focus on in the classroom, and it's really more in part to the enthusiasm of the teachers rather than to questions of funding and testing.
I've been sick as a dog for a week, so I'm kind of not myself. I taught U.S. history at the high school in Concord in the 80s, and when I started teaching, I asked my colleagues, what did the students have to know? And they said, well, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts requires them to take a year of U.S. history, but they don't have to pass it. So if you want to spend most of the time talking about Vietnam and you know, the free speech movement or whatever, you could do that. And it doesn't seem like it's changed a great deal. I really recommend the work that Dr. Anders and Dr. Stotsky have done advocating a return of, as Pioneer's been doing, a return to a serious U.S. history test as part of MCAS. But one of my greatest sort of insights over the last 25 years of working with student papers is that the vast majority of what I would call edu-pundits have no interest in the academic work of students. And one of the ways I would clarify that is by saying that there's a general agreement among edu-pundits that the most important variable in student academic achievement is teacher quality. And having been a teacher, I think teacher quality is very important. But I propose a different make on that, a different take on that. I think the most important variable in student academic achievement is student academic work. And student academic work is beneath the radar of almost everybody who talks about education. And the reason I have that perspective is because I'm only interested in student academic work. I published 1,044 history research papers by students from 46 states and 38 other countries in the last 25 years. And I think as long as the focus is on, Samuel Johnson says, example is always more efficacious than precept. And I think as long as we focus on what teachers are saying and never show students what their peers are doing in the way of good academic work, we're being really stupid. But not enough people agree with me to give me any funding. But just maybe one last comment. Another thing I've been, thanks to Sandra Stotsky and other people, very concerned about the Common Core. And actually, I've recently had an exchange with E.D. Hirsch about this. And E.D. Hirsch is very concerned about what he calls how-toism, that the focus is on skills rather than knowledge. And he said to me the other day that he's particularly concerned with the Common Core about the assessments, which are coming down the road. And it seems very likely that the assessments will focus on skills and not knowledge. So the knowledge of history is sliding down the slope and losing prominence and losing salience. And it's a very sad story. I won't go into it now, but in the 80s, Harvard made an effort to write a core for the college, and no professor would agree to let any other professor tell him what his students should learn about his subject. They had huge battles about it, and the outcome was they all decided to teach skills. And there's a wonderful essay from The Atlantic called Harvard's Hollow Core, which I will send you at the drop of a hat.
Hello, thank you all for coming. I'm a Yankees fan, so we have a good mix of folks here. I teach at the Advanced Math and Science Academy Charter School, so you're probably all wondering what I'm doing teaching at such a school with such a title. I've been trying over the past several years to get the heads of our school to change the name of the school to AHA, which would be Advanced Humanities Academy. It hasn't quite worked out too well. Just to kind of reiterate what everybody was saying, it truly is alarming what has been happening to the state of American history over the past few years and few decades. our nation is a unique nation. We are a nation that is not based upon race. We're not based upon class. We're not based upon religion. We're based upon an idea. We are based upon the idea of liberty, the idea of equality. And it's an idea that you can see in all of the basic documents and speeches that run through American history. You see it in the Declaration of Independence. You see it in the Constitution and the First Amendment. You see it in the Gettysburg Address. You see it in Emma Lazarus's poem dedicated to the Statue of Liberty. You see it in Martin Luther King's great speeches and sermons. We're dedicated to an idea. In Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, he said, he spoke about the idea of equality as being a proposition, and a proposition is something that needs to be engaged. A proposition is something that needs to be discussed. A proposition is something that needs to be reflected upon, thought about. And the fact of the matter is that the ideas that our nation was founded on and that have made us what we are not being reflected. They're not being engaged. They're not being considered. And each and every year, we are graduating students from our high schools. We are graduating students from our colleges who don't have any knowledge of our nation's history, who are not engaging our most basic ideas. We can see that anecdotally. We can see that in the test scores from NAEP. Just to give you one little nugget of information from the paper that Sandy and I wrote, the most recent 2010 NAEP test, 98% of graduating seniors could not identify the importance of Brown versus Board of Education. When I saw that statistic, that just speaks volumes. It's absolutely stunning. I mean, what does that say? They have no knowledge of the Supreme Court. They have no knowledge of the civil rights movement. Absolutely stunning. Anecdotally, I can talk a bit about the kids in my class. All great kids, wonderful kids. Last week we were discussing the rise of Jim Crow South after the Compromise of 1877, and I put out a few choice quotes from a few Southerners. One was from a Senator Tillman from Georgia, who spoke about the need for black folks to remain subordinate to white folks, and if they do not, he mentioned the word extermination. My students were just shocked by the level of racism in Jim Crow South. They were shocked by the prejudice that we saw through primary source documents. It was surprising to me to see how shocked that they were by that. I would hope, in one sense, I suppose being shocked is good because it's so awful what had happened. In another sense, I would hope that they would at least not be so shocked, that they had at least by the 11th grade, I teach 11th grade, that they had gotten a sense of what life was like in the South, or had gotten a sense of what the Civil War was all about, but plainly they had not. So you can see it anecdotally. You can see the decline in American history on NAEP scores, and the consequences of this in congressional elections. Many people don't even know who their congressional representative is. We're becoming a nation that doesn't know its past, and it seems that we're becoming a nation that doesn't care too much about its past as well. And that, I think, is deeply troubling.
Before we began this morning, Roger and I were having a discussion over coffee, and we were talking as teachers or former teachers sometimes will about the bromide. Well, if it doesn't get tested, it doesn't get taught. And we were both expressing our reluctance to enforce or suggest one more test for our schools to have. But at the same time, we shrugged and said, well, without a test, maybe it won't get taught. So my question, and this is for anybody, is there a way to get our K-12 system to be more attuned to history in the absence of a test, or is there any other choice other than just a test to make sure this gets taught? Will, you're laughing at me. I'm that naive.
I have this incredible bias towards student academic work, but Victor Henningsen used to be head of history at Andover, and he used to say that his students always forgot the questions on the AP exam, but they always remembered their paper, and so did he. That working on a history paper, and I published papers from 4,000 words to 32,000 words. One of the professor's students that he mentioned wrote a 32,000 word paper on the Regulator War in North Carolina, and it was a wonderful paper. Emerson Prize winner this year. She's at Stanford, and she had to cut it down to 2,500 words to win the National History Day. But and just another little story about her. But she also did a very long paper for our paper for National History Day on George C. Marshall, and she and I were talking because we had both read the 4-volume biography of Marshall, and she was saying how much she loved it, and she said, when I was interviewed at Harvard, I mentioned the work I'd done on Marshall, and my interviewer had never heard of him. she couldn't. But I guess, I think it's very important to be taught. I think a survey is good. I think textbooks are good. But I believe that once a student writes a serious history research paper, even if it's 8 pages in 8th grade, or 6 pages in 6th grade, or 10 pages in 10th grade, or 12 pages in senior year, they have become a participant in the historical process. And in the absence of that, it's very hard to engage them in history. I remember, just one last thing, I remember when I was teaching, I taught for about 10 years, and one of the things I noticed is that every year, 1 year of history turned from color to black and white. In other words, if you lived, the fall of the towers was in what, 2011? It's 2001. That's 12 years ago. If you have an 18-year-old student, they were 6. So stuff that is terrible being a teacher. I was born in 1936, so there's a lot of stuff that's still in color for me. But every year you notice that students who you think will have shared some history, that history is turned to black and white. It's no longer real history anymore. And the problem with black and white history is that it's in there with Churchill and Julius Caesar and Maria Theresa, and everybody's jumbled in there together. So one of the ways of bringing any part of history back into color, into life, is by doing a serious paper on it.
I would just like to say that a test is imperative. If there is no test, the school's resources, state resources are going to go to whatever is tested, be it English or math, which is what it's doing right now. And to me, it comes down to a question of what we value as a society. I don't wish to denigrate English or math. Certainly, absolutely essential. English and math are essential for helping a student going out into the world, getting a job. History and civics is something which I think is a little bit more profound. And that is, history and civics train you to be citizens in a democracy. And if we value our society, if we value our democracy, we have to put our money where our mouth is. And right now what we need is a state MCAS test in history.